There are only a few days left until the 2026 World Cup begins. The biggest tournament in football history, 48 national teams, 104 matches, 3 host nations. Everything should be filled with excitement. But instead of anticipation, FIFA is facing a question that is growing larger by the day. What is happening to the fans? It is not a national team withdrawing. It is not a stadium facing major problems. It is not a crisis on the pitch. Instead, it is the very people who have been the soul of the World Cup for generations who are starting to speak out. Supporters' organizations are protesting. Boycott discussions are emerging. Criticism aimed directly at FIFA is becoming louder and more frequent. And what makes this even more remarkable is that all of it is happening just before kickoff. The World Cup will still take place. The stadiums will still open their gates. Billions of people will still be watching. But behind all of it, one question continues to grow quietly in the background. Is FIFA beginning to lose the very people who turned the World Cup into the biggest sporting event on the planet? Make sure you watch this video all the way through, because what is happening right now may not simply be another pre-tournament controversy. It could be a sign of a much larger crisis that is only beginning to unfold. At first glance, there is nothing to suggest that the 2026 World Cup is facing any serious problems. FIFA continues to describe it as a historic tournament, the biggest World Cup ever organized. More national teams, more matches, more host cities. The stadiums are ready. The teams are completing their final training sessions. The biggest stars in world football are preparing to step onto the stage they have been waiting 4 years to reach. Everything appears to be unfolding according to plan. And that is exactly what makes this story so interesting. Because the signs of unrest are not appearing where people usually look. They are emerging underneath the surface. Inside fan forums, within supporters' organizations, during meetings involving European football associations, and in debates that, just a few years ago, almost nobody imagined would take place. As the World Cup approaches, the conversation should be centered on the favorites to win the tournament. Who will shine? Who will surprise the world? Who will make history? But instead, more and more people are talking about ticket prices, about visas, about travel costs, and about whether the World Cup is still meant for ordinary fans. That is what has started to concern many people across the football world. Not because the tournament is about to collapse, not because the World Cup is going to be canceled, but because the connection between FIFA and its traditional supporters no longer seems as strong as it once was. And once that feeling begins to take hold, bigger questions start to follow. If everything is truly going as well as FIFA claims, why are critical voices emerging from so many different directions at the same time? And perhaps even more importantly, are these simply the familiar complaints that appear before every World Cup? Or are they the first signs of a much larger conflict that is quietly beginning to take shape? Perhaps no issue has frustrated fans more than ticket prices, because this is the problem they see immediately. And it is the problem they have to pay for. For decades, the World Cup has been viewed as a dream for millions of supporters. A journey that might happen only once in a lifetime. Many fans save money for years just for the chance to sit in the stands and watch their national team play on football's biggest stage. But ahead of the 2026 World Cup, more and more people are beginning to realize that dream is becoming far more expensive than it used to be. Not just expensive, unpredictable. One of the most controversial issues has been dynamic pricing. Ticket prices are not fixed. They can change based on market demand. That means a fan may see one price when they begin the purchasing process, only to find a completely different price a few minutes later. From FIFA's perspective, this may be a reasonable business strategy. But for many supporters, the experience feels very different. They no longer feel like they are buying a ticket to a football match. They feel like they are participating in an auction. And that is when the backlash begins. Supporters groups speak out. Complaints are filed. The debates become louder and more intense. And gradually, the central question starts to change. Is this still a World Cup for traditional fans? Because the issue is no longer about a single match or a single stadium. It is about the direction of the tournament itself. The World Cup keeps getting bigger. Revenue keeps growing. Commercial deals become more valuable with every cycle. But if more and more supporters feel they can no longer afford to be part of it, what happens to the atmosphere that made the World Cup special for generations? And this may only be the beginning. Because for some fans, the problem is not that they do not want to buy a ticket. The problem is that even with a ticket in hand, there is still no guarantee they will actually make it to the World Cup. But let's assume ticket prices are no longer the problem. Let's assume you have saved enough money. You have been planning this trip for years. You are finally ready for the journey of a lifetime. Does that guarantee you will be sitting in a World Cup stadium? Not necessarily. And that is where a second front of this debate begins to emerge. Because more and more fans are realizing that the biggest obstacle is not always money. Sometimes it is access, visas, entry requirements, travel expenses, accommodation costs, and perhaps most importantly of all, uncertainty. In football, supporters can accept many things. They can accept their national team losing. They can accept a heartbreaking defeat. But what is much harder to accept is not knowing whether the trip itself will even happen. Many fans have spent years building their plans, booking vacation time, saving money, following schedules, waiting for this moment. Yet, as kickoff approaches, important questions still remain. Will the visa arrive on time? Will the paperwork be completed before departure? Will the entire trip be worth the risk? That is why many supporters' organizations have started talking about something bigger than ticket prices: the true accessibility of the World Cup. Because on paper, the 2026 World Cup is the largest tournament ever created. More teams, more matches, more host cities. But at the same time, an uncomfortable question has begun to emerge. If the tournament keeps getting bigger, why do so many fans feel that participating is becoming more difficult? That is when the story starts to move beyond football itself. Because when millions of people begin to feel they are being pushed further away from an event that was created for them, the issue is no longer just about ticket prices. It is no longer just about visas. It is no longer just about geography. It becomes about the feeling that the World Cup itself is changing. And the next question may be even bigger. What happens when decisions made in the name of growth leave more and more people feeling left behind? Up to this point, FIFA could still argue that every major tournament faces controversy. Ticket prices are always debated. Visa requirements are always complicated. International travel has always come with obstacles. But the third front is much harder to explain. Because it is not about money. It is not about paperwork. It is about consistency. For years, FIFA has spoken about the future of football, about sustainability, about social responsibility, about growing the game in a way that benefits future generations. These are messages that have been repeated again and again. Yet at the same time, the 2026 World Cup is the biggest tournament in history. 48 national teams, 104 matches, 3 host nations, host cities separated by thousands of miles. That means more flights, more travel, and greater logistical demands than ever before. And this is where the questions begin. Is FIFA trying to pursue 2 competing goals at the same time? On one hand, it wants to expand the World Cup beyond anything seen before. On the other hand, it wants to maintain the image of an organization committed to sustainable development. Perhaps both goals come from good intentions. But public perception does not always match official messaging. As the tournament grows larger, as revenue continues to rise, as the scale of the event keeps expanding, more people are beginning to ask a different question. What is FIFA's ultimate objective? To grow the game of football? Or to grow the World Cup itself? That is why the current debate is no longer taking place only between FIFA and the fans. It is increasingly becoming a debate between FIFA and the image it has spent years building. Because trust is difficult to earn, but very easy to question. And when concerns about ticket prices combine with concerns about accessibility, then combine with concerns about the direction of the tournament itself, small cracks begin to connect. And that is often the moment when separate complaints start to evolve into something much larger. So if all of these fronts are truly becoming linked together, is FIFA simply dealing with isolated criticisms? Or is it confronting a deeper problem of trust? And that is when everything starts becoming much harder to ignore. Let's take a step back and look at what we have just covered. First came ticket prices. Traditional fans began to feel that the World Cup was drifting further and further out of reach. Then came accessibility. Even those willing to spend the money could not be completely sure they would actually be able to make the trip. And finally came the question of direction. Where is the tournament heading? Who is it really being built for? And what is the cost of getting there? At first glance, these seem like three completely different stories. But the closer you look, the more they begin to resemble different pieces of the same puzzle. A picture of a growing gap between FIFA and a portion of its supporters. Perhaps FIFA is right. Perhaps the tournament will still be a huge success. Perhaps today's controversies are nothing more than the familiar noise that appears before every World Cup. But what concerns many observers is that warning signs are emerging from multiple directions at the same time. Supporters groups are speaking out. Football associations are raising questions. Boycott discussions have surfaced. Debates over ticket prices have not gone away. And a sense of frustration continues to linger even as the countdown is now measured in days. That is what makes the 2026 World Cup feel unusual, because this debate is not centered on a single match. It is not about one national team. It is not about a controversial refereeing decision. It is about the relationship between the biggest tournament in the world and the people who helped make it so valuable in the first place. Only a few days remain. Soon, many of the answers will begin to emerge on the pitch. But before the first ball is kicked, one question still hangs over the entire tournament. Is FIFA simply facing a storm that will eventually pass? Or is this the first sign that the World Cup model itself may be starting to reach its own limits? The 2026 World Cup may still become a massive success. The stadiums may be packed once the tournament begins. The debates over ticket prices may quickly be replaced by unforgettable goals and historic moments. Mexico may deliver the atmosphere that World Cup fans have always dreamed of. Canada may provide one of the most memorable football experiences in the nation's history. And FIFA may ultimately achieve the commercial goals it has been pursuing for years. It is also entirely possible that once the opening whistle blows, most of today's controversies will gradually fade into the background. World Cup history has seen that happen many times before, but there is something else worth considering. Even if the tournament succeeds on the pitch, the questions being asked before kickoff will not simply disappear. Questions about ticket prices, questions about accessibility, questions about the direction of the biggest tournament on Earth. Because sometimes a crisis is not measured by whether an event takes place successfully. It is measured by how many people begin to feel that they are no longer part of the story. And that may ultimately become the biggest debate surrounding the 2026 World Cup. The matches will eventually end. A champion will eventually be crowned. But trust, once cracks begin to appear, is rarely easy to repair. And history has shown that small cracks often lead to much larger changes. That is why the story surrounding the 2026 World Cup may not end when the final whistle blows. In many ways, it may only be beginning. Only a few days remain. Soon the debates will give way to the matches. The controversial headlines will give way to the opening whistle. And billions of people around the world will turn their attention to the 2026 World Cup. But before that happens, I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think FIFA is simply dealing with the normal challenges that come with organizing the biggest football tournament in history? Or do you believe that what we have discussed today could be a sign of a much larger issue developing behind the scenes? Let me know in the comments below. I am genuinely curious to see where you stand on this debate. And if you enjoy deep dives into the 2026 World Cup, FIFA, and the stories unfolding beyond the pitch, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss our upcoming videos. Because once the first ball is kicked, many of these questions will begin to face their first real test. But perhaps the biggest question of all will still remain. When the 2026 World Cup officially begins, will the controversies fade away? Or are they only just beginning?